Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas not a fortnight ago that Marguerite and I attended a dinner party hosted by Sir Thomas Lawrence, the acclaimed portrait artist, and friend of Sir Robert Peel the elder. Junior Peel, of course, at present is 5 years old and was at home playing knucklebones with his nanny. Now, his father is the owner of many cotton mills in Lancashire, and both he and his sister Anne were in attendance, and I soon came into discussion with Anne about the present condition of English textile manufacturing. Now, not surprisingly, Miss Peel was concerned for the welfare of the factory children, and understanding that over half of the employees at her brother's mills were children, that laws should be enacted to prevent the children from harsh or cruel treatment, and to limit their hours. What the children primarily did was to act as piecers, piecing together the threads of cotton which came apart during the violence of the spinning process. And they did this by twirling the two broken ends of thread round each other to join them again, at least temporarily. Miss Peel believed that this, along with the various other sundry tasks, was too harsh for the children, especially when 6 or 7. Thus, she believed legislation was in order. Now, having toured the many cotton mills of my friends and acquaintances, I endeavoured to make her aware of the following. First, many children in factories were employed along with their parents, who kept a watchful eye over them. My suggesting that in the main the parents could judge better than any government inspector what was in the child's and their families' best interests. In addition, if one factory treated children badly, they could always go to one of many others. And in fact, the average worker worked at 5 factories during his lifetime. Secondly, we must realize that some children are orphans who come from the parish poorhouse, and in this case, there is no parent looking after them. But then that would sadly apply as well in any job that they undertook. Thirdly, I pointed out to her as well that many children with parents, if their parents are farmers, as so many are, must help out on the farm, and as they grow older endure cold and wet weather and the stress of harvesting and planting and weeding. This too is no walk in the St. James Park. Fourthly, I also pointed out to the dear madam that when children are employed in mines, they receive significantly more pay. As a result, at least half again as much. Fifthly, I also mentioned that in the long term, the greatest welfare for children is achieved if their parents simply become richer, as is occurring in part in England, precisely because our mills are becoming ever more productive and profitable, and legislation would only hinder this process, whilst taking control of children away from their parents. So while it's true that sometimes parents allow children to be treated harshly, this was often because they were very poor or had many other children and needed all the money the children could earn. Miss Peel objected that some parents might not care for their children being drunkards and such like, but I responded that in this case the children would likely have a hard childhood irregardless. And finally, Miss Peel objected that perhaps the children might be stuck in factory work forever. But first, I pointed out that some employers certainly allowed half days off so that the children might go to school, And secondly, many of the children becoming adults left the factories to pursue other trades. They, having demonstrated in the textile factories, they were reliable workers. And with that, Miss Peel, fresh out of objections, smiled and thanked me, her conscience satisfied that the conditions of the children in her brother's factories were as well as could be expected. Now if we turn to the issue of the employment of children, as you in the 20th and 21st century understand it as having occurred in my own time, we find today a book on just that highly controversial subject, Clark Nardinelli's Child Labor in the Industrial Revolution. Nardinelli, understanding the liberal bias inherent in much of its history, especially in that concerning the treatment of women and children, here offers a weighty counterpoint, demonstrating how different and often better the reality really was. Nardinelli begins by describing the unusual circumstance underpinning the idea that child factory labor was such an unparalleled and unmitigated horror. The Factories Inquiry Commission of 1833 was convened to investigate the working condition of children in British factories. However, when finished, its report was often positive, saying, for example, that children are not ill-treated in mills. There may be instances, but generally they are as well treated in mills as anywhere else. Or that there are instances of their being cruelly treated in factories, but they are rare and exceptions to the general custom. The report had some negative testimony as well, as when other witnesses, often the children themselves, told stories of cruel treatment and ruined health. But despite the equally positive and negative testimony from both investigators and children, only the negative comments were released to the public. How did this occur? Because the intention of the commission was to present both pro and con as a debate, with the factory owners defending the system against the negative charges of their critics, pro and con. But the pro part was never included in the final draft, which meant that the factory system received an overwhelmingly negative appraisal, which would be repeated and used ad infinitum for almost 2 centuries thereafter. So what was the reality, and how were children treated? Let's start by describing the factory system itself. First, children 14 and under made up about 20% of the textile industry, the percent declining to 1835, then rising until about 1875, reaching 122,000 children, but then declining again severely afterwards for good. And by 1871, children employed in all factories and workshops, whether textile or otherwise, accounted for only 8.4% of the total population of children in England. What did the remaining 91.6% of children do? Some didn't work, but of those who did, they worked mainly in agriculture, domestic service, as apprentices, or in rural work like mining, with about 1/4 of all miners being children. But relatively few people focused on the travails of the children in the mines, compared to which factory work was often better. Why then did children have to work? Simply because, as Dickens wrote, these were hard times. And any contribution children could make to keeping the family out of poverty was very welcome. If, for example, the wages of a child could buy extra clothing for other family members in the cold of winter, or pay for the visit of a doctor for a sick family member, or help keep the family in better lodgings, all that income was again welcome. And so that meant that the long-run solution to children not working and to keeping or to their working in unpleasant occupations and conditions was to raise everyone's standard of living, which is exactly and ironically what the Industrial Revolution accomplished, raising English standards of living above those of every other country in the world and reducing the employment of children constantly throughout the 19th century. Partly, however, as a result of the negative publicity occasioned, as mentioned, by releasing only the negative findings of the factory inquiry, the Factory Act of 1833 was passed, which prohibited the employment of children under 9 years of age in all textile factories except silk, and limited children aged 9 to 12 to 48 hours per week. And yet many critics responsible for passing the act were unhappy with the new law. Why was that? Likely because it didn't limit the hours of adult men to 10 hours as they had wanted, and thus didn't artificially raise their wages by constricting supply. The commissioners believed that adult factory operatives were simply using the public's outrage over child labor to benefit themselves. By 1850, the total weekly work hours of children was reduced to 36, with children only allowed to work half a day, the other half mandated at school. The innumerable critics of industrialization range from the Romantic poets Wordsworth, Blake, and Coleridge to writers like Dickens, Disraeli, Carlyle, or Trollope, and philosophers like Marx and Engels. One of the rare defenders was historian Thomas Macaulay, who attacked the romantic idea that country life and fresh air were inevitably better for children. He instead pointing out the reality that the Industrial Revolution was resulting in vast improvements in British society and life. However, one unaddressed aspect that made the situation worse was that many parishes wanted to be rid of their orphan child paupers and thus sent them off to work in factories indifferent to their subsequent treatment. Next, in order to understand parental motivations and incentives, Nardinelli introduces the theories of economist Gary Becker, famous for having expanded the purview of economics to encompass families and marriage, most famously in his 1981 book, A Treatise on the Family. Becker's basic idea regarding families was the explicit recognition that households are producers in much the same way as businesses are. So if we consider the role of families in maximizing the production and happiness of their members, children are argued by Becker to play three roles. A, they are a type of consumption good made by parents, valuable in and of themselves. B, they are or can be producers in their own right, as when they work in factories. And C, they're obviously consumers of resources. Parents can obviously vary the amount of investment made in children, which can range from, on the one hand, having perhaps many low-quality children in which they don't invest much time, energy, or money, or on the other hand, fewer high-quality children who get lots of attention and resources. How much time and money parents invest depends on many factors, such as how wealthy they are, how much increased happiness, both on the part of parents and children, they can expect from the increased investment. So if parents believe their little Joey is the second coming of Isaac Newton, they might happily invest in a PhD for him. But if, on the other hand, all he does is master the tricks at the local skateboarding park, then they might bid him adieu earlier. Returning then to 19th century English parents, the number of children, average schooling per child, leisure per child, and amount of child labor supplied are chosen by parents to maximize the well-being of the family over time. So, for example, if women are, as they were, employed in textile factories, then the family might have more money for children, but might want to have fewer children because the mother would have to stay home to take care of them, giving up her job. Or they might give the children that they do have less time, but have more money to spend on them and their education. As time went on, this turned out to be true. Parents saw that investing in their children's human capital, their literacy and education, became more and more valuable. And so the supply of factory children started drying up. One of the key questions in understanding child factory labor was how valuable children were previously in other jobs such as helping out on the farm or in a cottage workshop. The evidence from numerous studies generally shows that children used more resources than they produced. Economically, they are a net negative, partly because they work so much less than adults and partly because they are much less productive when they do work. In summary, the consensus from the developmental literature is that throughout history, children have not been profitable investments in agricultural societies, although once children reach adolescence, they become more productive. But in contrast, one reason tens of thousands of children worked in the textile factories, despite or even because of their young age, was because they could be relatively productive. Being small, they could enter machinery spaces others couldn't, and with their nimble fingers, as previously mentioned, easily and quickly piece together broken threads of cotton. As a consequence, children now could also live longer with their parents because they would go home at night, whereas if they lived on a farm, a strange farm, served as apprentice to a butcher, or were a housemaid, they usually couldn't go home at night. Some of the more common additional misconceptions about child labor that Nardinelli contests are, number one, that factory children were stunted and smaller than average. This was not true, as a report by Horner found factory children actually being taller. However, all the English lower classes during this period in general were smaller due to a relative lack of nutrition and increased their height as the 19th century progressed. Number two, the misconception that textile factory children were less healthy than other factory workers or adult workers. Not true. Number three, another misconception was that children drove down the pay of adult men. But no significant relationship was found here between low wages for adult men and high wages for children. In fact, wages tended to be low for both children and men in the countryside and higher for both in the cities, since cities offered much greater productive employment opportunities. Number four, a fourth misconception is that children were forced to stay at one factory, and if they left, were blacklisted. This too was false, it being common for children to move frequently to different factories. And factories in urban areas tended to be exposed to more competition and thus offered both adults and children better wages than factories in isolated rural areas. A fifth misconception is that the Factory Acts, starting in 1802, limiting children's employment and mandating schooling, were helpful. Perhaps in the short term, but not likely at all in the long term, for two reasons. First, the employment of children in textile factories was going down over time as the machinery became more and more automated. The introduction, for example, of the self-acting automated spindle in the 1830s was typical, since it allowed one adult operator to manage 8 times more spindles than before. Secondly, regarding literacy, the increase in literacy rates after the Factory Acts were passed was no higher in textile areas than in others. So the law likely had no beneficial long-term effect. Nardinelli concludes by examining the varied reasons that motivated the passage of child labor laws in many countries. Generally speaking, laws were never enacted in the formative stage of the industry, but only later when it had reached maturity. And thus, by the time legislation was passed or became more strict, A, the demand for child textile labor was lessening significantly, and B, some manufacturers realized that they could use these laws to handicap their competitors who use children in their production process more. In France, for example, legislation occurred much later, partly because families tended to work together in the same factory much more. So what passed in 1802 in England was only passed in 1841 in France, and wasn't well enforced initially in both countries anyway. In Prussia, an initial law was passed in 1853,
but was also not well enforced. And given that the Germans tended to have more complex machinery, they didn't need children as much anyway. In the U.S., the southern states passed legislation in 1903, 60 years later than the North had in 1842, because southern textile manufacturing was much less developed. Recovering from the Civil War, the last thing the South wanted to do was to prevent children from earning money to help their families. And so ends our tour of Nardinelli's superb book. I would give it an A. Hopefully more people will understand that the Industrial Revolution was primarily only harsh at times because it was lifting people out of a very harsh poverty to begin with. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.